All right, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Danny Yegan. I'm our Faculty Development Chair. And thank you for joining our second installment of our speaker series, our economic speaker series. It's really our department's way to say thank you, to build bonds, to continue the bonds past campus as a community of ideas that's connected with the real world, which is really where economics lies. You know, it's a science, but it's applied to our economy day in and day out. I am absolutely delighted that Ulrike Mlamendier is here with us. I'm about to introduce Britt to give our introductory words, but I did want to share a story that I'm not sure Ulrike actually knows, which is that in my first semester of graduate school 15 years ago, our professor, David Lapson, had written on the board all these equations about how people were supposed to act. And then he calmly put down the chalk and said, but we're learning this isn't actually how people act. And in fact, any day now, and he looked at his watch, Ulrike Mlamendier is getting tenure at Berkeley for contribution after contribution, showing how people really act and how we can integrate that into our economic model. So it's a delight to be her colleague now, and a delight to have her here today. To really introduce Ulrike, we have let me get this right, the co-chair of the UC Berkeley Women in Leadership Circle Peninsula chapter, which works with the North Bay chapter, Britt Sellen, to be able to introduce us today into Ulrike's talk. Britt has graciously been a partner of social sciences, of economics for so long, and it's just a delight that she'll be here to introduce Ulrike. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Yegan, for all your work with the faculty development group. I think you call it officially the faculty development chair. Thank you for all of that. Welcome to the second installment, as Professor Yegan said, of our Berkeley Economics Speaker Series. Today we're featuring Cora Jane Flood, Professor of Finance and Professor of Economics, Ulrike Mlamendier, or sometimes Malmendier, depending on what country you're in. Professor Malmendier is a leading scholar in the fields of behavioral science, behavioral finance, and corporate finance. Her work on behavioral biases in financial markets has been featured in publications including the New York Times, The Economist, Investors Chronicle, and the Wall Street Journal. In August 2022, she became an official SAGE, which means she was appointed by the German government for a 5-year term as one of the 5 economic experts that make up the German Council of Economic Experts. Her work has received numerous awards and recognition, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship, and the prestigious Fisher Black Prize from the American Finance Association, given biennially to the top financial scholar under the age of 40. I Googled her. There's a lot more going on there. I do know that she's in the top 5% of economists who are asked for commentary, feedback, consultation worldwide. Thank you for being with us today, all of you, and please join me in welcoming Professor Ulrike Mlamendier and her topic on how inflation changes the way we think.
Thank you so much. As my lead. I regard in your history textbooks pictures like this of people and bundles of Reichsmark, which are completely worthless than other than maybe to play with for children. And of course, you also learn what happened of this economic turmoil, how and ultimately the rise of the Nazis. In Germany, we lived through hyperinflation. the worldwide economic crisis. Constantly criticizing the European Central Bank that they're not combating inflation. And constantly concepts of monetary policy making, which many of us learned in graduate school. Those of you who are economists have probably in undergrad or graduate, doesn't quite have room. Prices. Along. Let's use monetary support. It's more expensive for people to spend their money. Prices won't rise as much anymore. Inflation will go down to maybe the target of 2%. Again, people will act as they did before, of course, maybe controlling for any losses in their assets they may have encountered. Now, this is not rates the US pays, reaching a peak again in the this is on. Doing all you can, maybe devil's no good. Using the usual Federal Reserve tools to combat inflation, he realized that however credible his measures and appropriate his measures were at the time, he didn't see people really recognizing it and people coming to the belief we would go back to a world of price stability. So as this quote here says, he recognized that there was an entire generation, in particular of younger adults, that had grown up since the mid-60s, knowing only inflation, nothing but inflation, inflation that keeps increasing. And as he pointed out, he found it in these circumstances hardly surprising that many of them, many citizens, have begun to wonder whether it is realistic to anticipate a return to general price stability. So I love this quote, which I actually own to the now Fed president in New York, who dug it out for me. I love this quote as like pointing to the fact that even experts who do exactly the right thing, let's say, or the usual tool, employ the usual tools to combat inflation, realize some are not arriving with the people. They're sticking to their thinking about inflation. And I need to do something else. I have to recognize a mechanism which traditional monetary policy hasn't really had room for, to kind of be able to convince them that we live in a world of price stability. Because I do need to convince them only if expectations are adjusted to assume price stability will actually happen. So to put it differently, in traditional economics, whether it's monetary economics or other economics, there is little room for the world you've lived through, your personal experiences, having a lasting impact on how you look at the world above and beyond the hard facts. So whether I've personally experienced a crisis or whether I just know that these outcomes can happen and understand the mechanism, shouldn't make a difference in my decision-making going forward, right? All we economists think is relevant is that I have the information, I understand the mechanism, and of course, I want to hold constant how much wealth and income and education I have. But if we are able to hold this constant, then personally living through high or hyperinflation should not be any different in influencing my thinking about money, my worries about inflation, than knowing about past realizations and the best predictor of future realizations. And this applies to other economic phenomena as well. So whether or not I lived through the great financial crisis or the Great Depression should be no different in its effect on my thinking and on my decision-making, on my asset allocation, my job choices, my family choices, than learning about it, knowing about these outcomes. Or another example I've studied is unemployment. Whether or not you've personally experienced unemployment in the past, maybe in you individually, or you've saw it in your family growing up, or you just know about what the risk of unemployment is for you, right? Like compared to people today, they have the exact same education, exact same wealth, exact same job situation going forward. One has arrived in this situation born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Everything has gone smoothly. They studied at Berkeley, got a job right away. The world was perfect. The other person grew up in a family where there were lots of struggles, but kind of made their way there. Traditional economics would say, oh, let's look at what characterizes them today. What's their wealth, income, education, etc. Let's maybe also look into the future, right? Like what's their future employment or unemployment risk, their future income potential. Once we know all of that, we know everything we need to predict what kind of choices they will be making, how much they will be saving, how much they will be spending, what kind of jobs they choose. But that's not the case. People who have lived personally through unemployment or have witnessed it in their firm, in their family, will forever, for a long time, remain kind of scarred. They tend to go to safer jobs, they tend to consume less and actually save more and build up, accumulate wealth. So all of this has very little room in economics. My last example here, the pandemic, right? So we have all lived through the COVID-19 pandemic. Is that the same as just being informed, similar to the Spanish flu, about something like this can happen? Assume your wealth, your health, your other circumstances have not been affected. Do you think you're acting exactly the same now as you would have if you've just been informed about the likelihood of that happening? Probably not. A lot of people would say no. And that's exactly what here in Berkeley we're trying to change. We're trying to integrate into economics. We're trying to integrate a knowledge, a recognition of the fact that personal experiences have a lasting impact on our beliefs, on our outlook on the world, and on our behavior. If these are bad experiences, they're scarring effects, and I'm going to talk a lot about the bad outcomes today, but it actually also goes the other way around. If I've had really good experiences, my beliefs, my outlook at the world changes as well in a lasting manner. And that's not something we economists are making up. We are just inferring abstractly from data. There's very good neuroscience underpinning about the neuroplasticity of our brain, how our brain gets literally rewired as we live through COVID-19, as we live through the great financial crisis, as we live through the Great Depression, which we are trying to leverage in this research. What this research, what this new wave of research is basically trying to do is to say that we as humans, as living, breathing organisms, as I like to say, are entities that change, that are not the same pre and post crisis, pre and post experience as a computer, as an automaton would be. Neuroscience tells us that we change as we walk through life. So let's try to see whether that might be important for better predicting economic decision-making, economic belief formation, and ultimately economic outcomes. So to put it in the kind of tradition of development of economic science from a very Berkeley perspective, right? If I start with a traditional neoclassical economics, our famous Homo economicus, that is this robot, if you want, automaton, if you want, which you feed all the relevant information. And if you do that, Homo economicus comes up with the perfect decision on what choices to make, given available information, given available wealth or other means. It's a rational payoff maximizing entity. And of course, that Homo economicus has served us very well in predicting market outcomes, equilibrium outcomes in many settings. It still dominates, I would say, a lot of economic modeling, a lot of economic analysis today. As somebody who, as we're just saying, is also involved in policy, I certainly see it at work in politics and policy as well. Humans are often presumed to be little supercomputers which process all the input you give them. Now, behavioral economics came along, and I'm proud to say that, you know, we consider Berkeley the birthplace of this new, more realistic, psychologically more realistic view of human decision-making, and try to instill psychological realism into our individual decision-making. Try to make our modeling and our predictions more realistic, accounting for mistakes we make, whether we are overconfident, whether we are suffering from sunk cost fallacy and are throwing good money after bad money, whether we have limited attention. All of these realistic features of human decision-making, which social psychologists have known about for a long while, we realize we have to integrate into our models. These are not just white noise type of errors, which we can ignore, as we used to think as economists. These are systematic. So it's worthwhile trying to put them into economic models and come to better predictions about our financial decision-making, about our job choices, or what maybe David Leibson talked about in that class, the decision to go to the gym, to enroll in a gym and rather not go to the gym. To better understand why we do that, behavioral economics is very useful. Now, here's the thing. As much as I love behavioral economics, and I'm a card-carrying member of the behavioral economics group, you are still assuming people are little robots or automata in some sense, right? You've just kind of now added a little flaw to the software. So I've worked a lot on overconfidence. So I add this little flaw that you overweigh good outcomes too much and like therefore have expectations which are too positive. But once I've modeled you that way, that's what you're going to do for the rest of your life, right? You're just still taking all the input and spitting out your decision on kind of what are your posterior beliefs and what are the choices you're going to make. And as I said before, that doesn't seem quite to jive with this neuroscience perspective on our brain getting rewired as we work through life, or go to medicine, epidemiology, biology, our body changing as we are living through stressful times and are dealing with inflation, with inflammation, with hormonal changes, etc. And so what we're currently trying to do as a large group of behavioral economists here at Berkeley is to make it more human, less robot, more human, if you want, to account for the fact that we don't just have this mind that's constantly updating and spitting out outputs. We also have a body and mind and body are systematically affected by the experiences we make. In fact, that's, as I mentioned before to a few people over lunch, that's in fact the focus of this new center. We've started across different departments, the O'Donnell Center for Behavioral Economics, where past PhD students like Leslie Shen, who's now at the Boston Fed, or Alex Steiny-Welcio at SUCB, or postdocs like Luisa Cifala, and current PhD students are working on this idea for what areas of decision-making can we try to become more realistic of us not being the same entity as we are making experiences, whether it's inflation, whether it's in the stock market, whether it's unemployment, take whatever area you want. Maybe we economists shouldn't just capture what currently describes you, and maybe your prospect looking forward. Maybe economists have to keep track of all the past data, this whole big matrix of past realizations, of unemployment, of stock market outcomes we have lived through, of political outcomes we've lived through, and put some weight on them in predicting what we do in the future. So let me try to kind of strengthen a little bit this link to neuroscience I'm currently alluding to. And one concept I really like, one parallel I really like to emphasize is the concept of synaptic tagging. It's very nano, it's very micro, and I'm stretching out a little bit and translating it into like a daily human decision making, but your scientists have reassured me that they all seem the same parallel we are seeing there. So what neuroscientists have been teaching us is that as we are living our lives and making experiences, every time we make an experience, we see something, we feel something, our brain forms a connection. There are neurons, a firing neuron, a receiving neuron, and the connection, the synapse is formed. The brain is constantly doing that. It's constantly creating these pathways, reorganizing these pathways in our brain, creating new connections, creating even new neurons. So all of this is part of the concept of neuroplasticity, which is developing in response to our learning, to our experiences, and memory foundation. We knew for a long time that this is happening in little people, in children, right? That's why we parents put so much effort into trying to wire it the exact right way, which we think will be useful for the rest of their lives, but actually it never stops. As we are walking through life, our brain keeps changing. That's the concept of synaptic tagging, the synapses being formed throughout our lives. Now, there's one aspect I've been particularly interested in, sometimes called LTP, here stands for long-term potentiation, which captures the fact that when we make experiences that are particularly strong, that are particularly long-lasting, these synapses get really strengthened. So now, starting to get back to my inflation topic of today, if I've lived for a long time through periods where every time I go to the supermarket, I see the price for bread or milk yet again have gone up, and prices keep rising and spiraling upwards out of control, this gets really strengthened, this connection between supermarket price, fear, can I afford, food for my family, how will I move forward? And even if that period is over, that reaction is still pretty automatic. It's still pretty present in my brain. When we lived through the recent rise in inflation in 2021, 2022, I have some Argentinian co-authors who had experienced inflation back home. They were telling me how much that was triggering these emotions of fear, how they're going to the bank, checking that everything is safe, etc. That's exactly what I mean. And a really interesting aspect neuroscientists emphasize is that how emotional an event seems to matter. So one thing is to kind of cold-bloodedly live through these times and say, okay, I'm good, my financials are good, well, I pay whatever it costs to buy the food. Another one is to worry and be afraid whether you're able to provide for your family. Whenever you have an emotion, and it can also be a positive emotion, these experiences attain really privileged status in your memory, and that long-term potentiation is there to last. And what is so hard for economists to get around towards understanding, including myself, is that this experience knowledge that has been programmed into your brain by personal experience, is so much stronger than any learned knowledge, right? So to give you an example that's not an inflation example, which comes from stock market participation, right? Here in the US, a famous example of people who really don't like the stock market are the so-called depression babies. People who've lived through the Great Depression saw the stock market crash, prices tumble, and for the rest of their lives decided, well, if there's one thing I want to stay away from, it is the stock market. Well, as a finance professor, I would have hoped that if I sit down with them and explain really well the concept of diversification and how low the risk is if you are broadly diversified in many different assets, like you have an MSCI World Index, not individual stocks. If I explain the equity premium puzzle and how worthwhile it has been to invest in the stock market, they would all get around towards and saying, okay, you know, maybe I should invest in a broadly diversified way in the stock market. Turns out my ability to do that is pretty limited. Even if these people completely understand, even if my audience completely understands what I've been explaining, if I give them a test where I ask about diversification, equity premium, and they get all the answers right and the test is A+, doesn't mean that they are changing their personal allocation from some kind of fixed income to stock. So what I'm trying to say is that these personal experiences and how they shape our thinking can be really powerful and apparently overwhelm our rational, logical thinking. And here's my favorite example to illustrate that. My example is a guy who was born under the name of Heinrich Wallich in Germany in 1914. He was born in Berlin into a family of bankers, and with his family lived through that infamous Weimar hyperinflation in 1923. His family, and he emigrated to the US. They went through South America, landed in the US. After a little bit of a career in the banking industry, in the financial industry, he ended up at the New York Fed and then got a PhD in economics at Harvard. Taught at Yale for a while, and ultimately ended up on the Federal Reserve Board, where he was a governor from 1974 to 1986. Now, this guy was clearly a very smart guy who had all the data you ever want to calculate best predictions about future inflation at his fingertips, had all the models, had all the stuff to help him with that. And nevertheless, he, to this day, holds the record in terms of dissenting in the Federal Open Market Committee meetings, right, where the chairperson proposes whether they raise or lower interest rates and the other members say something about it. He still holds the record in dissenting and warning his colleagues that they just don't get it, that inflation might be around the corner and the effects of inflation are terrible, and that we have to be more hawkish and raise rates further to make sure this doesn't happen. He clearly understood he was not in Weimar. He was not in Germany. He was in the US now, in a different monetary policy regime, in a different decade, in a different economy, right? It's not that he was not smart enough to understand this, and yet he couldn't shake that personal experience. So I like this example, and you know, there's more than an example. There's obviously a whole study looking at Federal Open Market Committee members' beliefs about inflation and how they're shaped by their personal experiences. But this example really signifies, illustrates why it's so important for us economists not just to think about these deviations from Homo economicus as some mistake, which we can get rid of if we only teach you well enough how you should really make decisions. We have to recognize that as humans, we will be shaped by our lifetime experiences. Now, up to now, I've been talking a lot about lifetime experiences, which are pretty traumatic, right? So I talked about the German hyperinflation, I mentioned the Great Depression, the pandemic, what neuropsychiatrists call trauma with a big T. There is, however, also trauma with a small t. This is not just about the big crises. The notion of experience effects can also be about daily exposure, daily worry about food insecurity, price insecurity, unemployment worries. So in trying to convey how important it is for us economists to take it into our into our models and our predictions, let's go to some daily experiences. Let's again try to remember, like for example, 2021, 2022, how it felt like to be in the grocery stores and see all these prices rising and like packing your groceries in your bag and kind of worrying a little bit about what is happening to the invoice you have to pay at the end. It turns out that putting yourself into the into that mindset and thinking about what this might do to you can help us explain one of the biggest puzzles in the literature, in the research about inflation, which is gender differences in inflation. So for more than 50 years, researchers, starting with a Swedish researcher and Swedish data, but by now across the world and for sure in the US, have documented over and over again that if you ask people about their inflation expectations, they're often wrong, they often exaggerate, but it's in particular the women who are really pessimistic and expect really high inflation. And researchers have been wondering where that comes from. Do the women just not have enough financial literacy? Are women not good with numbers? What else do we need to do that people, in particular women, finally have more realistic understanding of future price developments? Well, guided by this idea that personal experiences may matter, we did, and that was before the recent spike in inflation, we did a survey that was a little bit different, an inflation survey that was a little bit different than past inflation surveys. We started from going to households and doing the same thing researchers have done before, ask people, what do you think prices will be in a year? How high do you think the inflation rate will be? And even at that time of basically zero inflation, or definitely around or below the 2% target, if you take the difference between women and men, even conditioning on the same household, right, everything else is the same, women had higher inflation expectations. So at that point was just half a percentage point, but given that there was basically no inflation, that was significant. So we replicated this old result that women expect higher inflation. And then when you throw into this analysis all your controls for education and background and wealth and income, that thing doesn't move. Like, women are more pessimistic about future inflation. But then we asked one new question, and that new question is inspired by the picture and the noise I showed you before, which is, by the way, in your household, who does the grocery shopping? Now, conforming with traditional gender roles, it still tends to be more often the woman than the man. In these households, about 69, 70%, it was a woman who's mostly or doing all of the grocery shopping. And then we included that variable. Do you do any grocery shopping for your household into this analysis of beliefs about future inflation? Well, it turns out that if the male head of household is not doing any grocery shopping, that's exactly when the big differences in beliefs about inflation come out. If both sides are doing grocery shopping, there was no difference, no gender difference whatsoever in this representative US sample of consumers. So what this is saying is that somehow this experience of going to a grocery store seems to have a big impact on how we think about prices in general. We all know this is just the milk and the bread. It's not like the car or the house, which is much more financially important, but I do it only every couple of years or a couple of decades even. It's this daily exposure to prices that seem to have a really big impact, even if they're small. Now, previous literature on inflation, not our own research, has already shown that when we see highly volatile prices, we tend to remember in particular the upswing, not so much the downswing. So if you expose people to highly volatile prices, and unfortunately some of the most volatile prices out there are grocery prices, that means they remember a lot of price increases and not decreases. Of course, if inflation is rising, even more so, but even with stable monetary value, that's the case. In other words, send people grocery shopping all day long. It might also be energy, yeah, but you can do it with gas, oil as well. They will have excessively high inflation expectations. So it's not about training people better, about finance, about making sure women have the mathematical education. It's simply that their lived reality is different, which is the reason why we see these big differences in inflation expectations. So what can we do with that? So, a lot of this research we are trying to push here at Berkeley to recognize that our personal life experience have an important role to play in predicting beliefs and decision making is the one step. But of course, as economists, and definitely as economists involved in policy, we would like to understand what can we do with this. Well, step one is to simply recognize the reality that there are long-lasting implications of personal experiences. When I see policymakers trying to combat a crisis, whether it's COVID-19 or the sharp rise in energy prices we had in particular in Europe, more so than here in the US, there's often this attitude, okay, if I just get these variables under control, everything will be good again. And turns out, often it's not the case. We had the same here with the great financial crisis. When the economy is more or less back to normal, consumer optimism was still not there. Spending behavior was still not there, even here in the US, where we have pretty spending heavy population compared to some European countries. So what is going on? Well, what's going on is that your mind is still partly in the crisis. You have been rewired and you can't switch to, oh, we are out of the crisis right now. And that's important to recognize if you want to better predict the effect of your policy measures. Now, recognizing not only that, but also that there's a certain automaticity to it, that there's a neurological rewiring happening in your brain, that no information campaign or however credible announcement of policy changes will be able to outweigh your personal experience is important. So let me tell you one example which might get me in trouble with my economics colleagues, which is a policy measure the German Treasury Secretary chose to implement during the spike in energy prices after the attack of Russia on Ukraine, when going to the gas pump became so incredibly expensive for Germans. As an economist, my training says that, well, if that happens, the last thing you want to do is to subsidize gas at the gas pump, because you want the signal, the price signal, this is really expensive. You want this to be at work and induce people to avoid driving as much as possible and fill up the gas tank as little as possible. You might want to help them, but help them with lump sum payments, not by subsidizing the prices. Well, our finance minister didn't think so. He thought, okay, let's just subsidize prices. People will be so much happier. And all the economists have been rolling their eyes and saying that was the most terrible idea. Now, officially, that's also my position. But between us, what this did is it made the whole experience much less scary. He nicely timed it to happen just before the summer holidays, when the Germans all get in their cars and drive to Italy to have some nice, summer vacation in a nice area. And that fact that this wasn't quite as bad, quite as scary as it could have been, I think was important to prevent people from experiencing scarring effects that are too strong. So what I'm trying to say here is that thinking more about what kind of policy measures will affect you in your daily life right now, even if the amount isn't so large, even if there's some inefficiency from a standard economic perspective, but it just changes your life experience in this moment, turns out to be more powerful than we have previously understood. Now, of course, that ideally is translated into measures that immediately affect your daily life, like going to the gas pump and how scary that is. But it might also affect the way you communicate, the way you use media. The more you can make communication experiential, the more you can make people put themselves into a situation where they see the effect of a policy measure to be taken, the better. When I was presenting at the annual Sintra conference of the ECB 2 years ago, one of the executive board members was saying, well, Madame Lagarde, what Ulrike is trying to tell you is that you should have Netflix movies explaining monetary policy. And that's actually pretty close to what I mean. For example, one different way of communication one of my co-authors found in the central bank of Jamaica is to not just explain what inflation is about and why we want stable inflation, but instead to have reggae songs about which inflation rate you might want. And we don't all have to do reggae songs, but using a way of communicating that speaks to you emotionally to different senses can turn out to be much more powerfully than the economists have previously understood. All right, I'll stop here. Looking forward to questions you may have. Thanks so much for joining for my talk.
Thank you so much, Ulrike. That is the first talk I have been to with reggae in it. So that will be a memory that I carry with me. Okay. It already worked. Okay, so we have a second microphone, and I will moderate some Q&A. Please, Lisa.
Is it on?
Or you can hold this, Ulrike, if
I can just shout it.
Oh, yeah, shout it.
I'll just shout it.
It might be harder for the people online.
Okay. Can you hear me? There we go. Thank you so much, Professor. Really fascinating. I have a question for you. Have you or others tried mapping demographic, let's say in the US, demographic cohorts who have experienced different inflation, um, realities during critical parts of their spending years and see whether or not that sort of correlates then? Because I was listening to an NPR piece about 33-year-olds, and my daughter's one of those, who are sort of like the pig and the python. They're all reaching the same stage of life at the same time. They're trying to buy a house. They're competing for jobs. So does that have an impact on inflation expectations?
Yeah, exactly. So in some way, you have described my methodology very well here. These effects, which we are calling experience effects, are basically cohort effects, if you want. So when economists use the word cohort effect, it's often a little bit abstract. We just kind of say, okay, this birth year, this birth year, this birth year, but we don't have a really signed prediction in which whether you're more or less optimistic, pessimistic. And so now we come along and say, all right, give me your birth year. Let me calculate the average lifetime experience of whatever variable we are looking at, in this case, inflation. And I can tell you something about your inflation fears or inflation expectations going forward. In fact, you know, if you think about it, why is there a notion that there's a Gen X, a Gen Y, why the baby boomers, the greatest generation? Well, the underlying notion is, after all, they've all lived through some similar experiences that must have shaped them in a way that makes them more similar among themselves compared to people in, you know, otherwise similar circumstances. And that's exactly what we're trying to identify. Now, what I would emphasize is that sometimes this notion of certain generations having certain features, I mean, take, for example, the depression babies, is very static. So in fact, that's the way I presented it myself before. I said, oh, you've lived through the Great Depression for the rest of your life. You will hate the stock market like the plague and avoid it like the plague, etc. And what we are adding to this notion is that that's not exactly right, because you keep developing, right? If the world becomes better, your brain gets rewired. In fact, that's the best way to, if you want to change your behavior, expose yourself to outcomes which are related to this kind of type of behavior, like stock market investment you want to experience. Do a little cognitive behavioral therapy with the stock market, right? Put like just $50 in a broadly diversified fund. A year later, look back and say, it wasn't so bad. You know, so it's kind of, you can keep changing if you only expose yourself to different circumstances. But that's kind of an add-on to the NPR example you gave, which I completely agree with. And I would see this as an underpinning of this notion.
So, question for you from a political economic standpoint. I agree with you on the human economics, you know, that it scars you, whatever the case may be. So as a policymaker or as the president of the United States, first question is, how do you rewire so that, you know, I'm old enough where you went through the misery index during the Carter, and then all of a sudden within a 4 to 8 year span, Reagan, forget about the, you know, if you agree or disagree, there's a perception, hey, he was able to bring optimism back. So how do you rewire, number one? And then number two is, you know, we have the situation where non-college graduates in large numbers support Trump, and you don't need to get into political discussion. And a lot of it, I think people say there was a lot of scarring that he understood and took advantage of. And therefore, Democrats say, let's throw Obamacare, let's throw daycare, let's throw all these programs to reduce the cost side of their lives. And yet, they still don't see that this is going to benefit them. And they vote on a laissez-faire economy, which may not be as beneficial. So as a leader, you know, it's like typical academics, you say, I know this is true, but tell me how to fix this. How do we rewire so that we move, because you know, I'm old enough for economics, optimism and confidence are very critical in economic progression. So therefore, how do we rewire quickly?
Yeah. I wish I had to, yeah, small side question here. And in fact, So last week I was I had to suddenly fly to Berlin in this, what the Germans call the SAGE, the Council of Economic Advisor role for a secret meeting. I mean, now it's leaked, so it's not so secret anymore, but I mean, between the, the Treasury Secretary and the Econ Secretary, and were asking me more or less that question, right? Like, so you're the expert on like expectations. I need to change people's expectations pronto, very quickly. How do we do that? Well, the first news I always have is bad news, because I'm saying your lifetime experiences stay with you. And just like, even if there's a complete regime change, we know rationally from now on things will be different. Our brain will just function as if with some probability we assume the world to continue. And we just have to recognize that. It's very contrary to certain monetary policy tools like unconventional monetary policy. A lot of policy measures don't work as well in this world. So the first news is bad news. But then looking at the neuroscience literature and looking at how in particular really large changes and emotional changes seem to have the strongest effect in rewiring, that's kind of what I told them we need, right? So you don't need the kind of flow of money that supports you a little bit against upside down risk, which is of course important. But if you're just talking about changing your worldview, you need this big emotional thing that's happening to you that all of a sudden makes you feel things are better. So in this context, we're talking about, entrepreneurs and CEOs who are all pessimistic about the current government's economic policy. And what do you need to do to convince them they're actually trying to do something for them? Well, have some big measures. So in Germany, the big problem is we don't have enough workforce. We are a shrinking population, and that's their big struggle, that they don't have enough workers. Do some huge measure, some agreement, whether it's with India or like the UK recently did this big immigration efforts with Nigerian workers, something that really stops you in your track and you see it at work in your daily life. That's kind of what we would need. Yeah, so, yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, so the absolutely logical and correct answer, like question was, okay, if we need this big shocking change and you want to get people's inflation fears out of their mind, you need to go all in, stop inflation, be super drastic. I don't care about the economy, soft landing, forget about it. We're just going to stop this inflation business right now. I would say this will work for inflation fears, indeed. There's another problem though, which is if we have a drastic economic downturn, there's new scarring happening, and that can be equally bad in terms of having long-lasting traces on your willingness to invest in your human capital and your spending behavior and so on. So in some sense, the conflict between monetary and fiscal policy we lived through, in particular in Europe in recent years, where, right, we had like inflation increasing, but not in a, sometimes the textbook inflation is like, economy is booming, everybody's super excited, buying, prices go up, no big deal. We raise interest rates to stop a little bit of that spending, good, okay for the economy and okay for inflation. But we were in this situation post-COVID with like supply chain issues, the economy doing badly, the war further complicated supply chain. So we had to be really careful. And the politicians were like, no, I want to put fiscal stimulus into my country to keep the economy going. And the ECB was like, please don't do that. Like, we are trying to stop inflation here. So this conflict, which you always have, is, I'm afraid, heightened from the perspective of experience effect. So unfortunately, I don't have an easy answer, even though the intuition was exactly right.
So I would argue that there have been historical shocks in the other direction. Social Security, it took time, price controls, retirement of currency. Some, countries that are in hyperinflation have gone on the dollar, right, to get rid of this kind of thing. The psychological effects, it spawns other psychological effects. But I'm more curious about you talk a lot about crises. What about just 3% to 7% type of changes? Is it really sparking that kind of concern? I'm one of those Volcker young people who expected 7% the rest of my life for a mortgage, let's say. And when I got a 3% mortgage, like, oh my God, this is amazing. But you could argue that it's not the 3 or the 7, it's that difference, right? So now all these people who are locked into 3% 30-year mortgages are killing the rest of the economy because they have this sort of differential benefit that doesn't exist anymore. So I'm wondering if you have to temper a little bit of the psychology of it all or the neural science of it all with some of this disequilibrium that's built into the system itself. Or
Yeah.
something like that.
No, I mean, for starters, of course, equilibrium effects are there, right? Like whether behavioral economics or even the more human version of behavioral economics, demand and supply, that's still at work. So I completely agree with that. I do want to say, though, an interesting finding in particular on the research on inflation expectations has been that, you know, whether I look at this classical one big shock I was talking about here, like whether it's the Volcker years or pre-disinflation or even the Weimar hyperinflation, or I look at more stable but occasionally rising periods of inflation, this model of give me your birth year and I roughly take your lifetime average. I mean, to be more precise, it's actually with declining, roughly linearly declining weights. So there's some recency bias, but you know, stuff in the past still matters. That tends to work even for these smaller ranges, like the 2 to 5, 3 to 7%. So the mechanism seems to be at work even then. I do think there's an exacerbated effect of these crises just because of the emotional component, which you might not have during these periods. But it works always. You don't need a crisis for those models to work.
How does declining social trust fit into your model? And you mentioned other categories. What about people who identify as Republican and Democrat? How does that figure in too?
Yeah. It's actually interesting. One of the PhD students, Clint Hamilton, which I had on the slide before, is exactly interested in understanding this question. So what we have seen in particular over the last 10, 15 years, but has been going on for a while, is an extreme polarization, even with respect to predicting objectively verifiable variables, right? Not just, oh, is Bidenomics good or bad, where, you know, you would understand that Democrats and Republicans answer differently. But if I ask you, predict inflation, predict stock market returns, predict interest rates, you see this very striking flip back and forth that during the Trump years, the Republicans had the more optimistic view. And then during the Biden years, the Democrats have the more optimistic views. The graphs are super striking in their extremeness. And we haven't had them that extreme, even with respect to objectively verifiable data at all. Now, an interesting question is whether there's basically an interaction effect in your ideological leaning and your perception of the world. So in my models so far, I don't do that. I just kind of say, as I said, give me your birth year, let me get the time series on inflation. I'm going to calculate your lifetime average with some weights, and I'm going to have your predicted, what your inflation expectations are. And that works pretty well. However, now, should I, in particular in light of the evidence from the last 10 years, take into account whether the current president, for example, was your political affiliation or not, and correspondingly upweight or downweight a bit, the evidence suggests that I might have to do that. And it's not surprising, right? It's all about how I perceive the world around me, right? The same shock can affect me much more than it affects Danny. We had in our reading group about this experience effects, about this new wave of behavioral economics, we had a stress and resilience researcher at Berkeley, Daniela Kaufer, recently talked into our reading group, and she talks about the experiments you can do, not with humans, but with rats. You expose them to all sorts of stress. I mean, poor rats. I mean, yeah, so they like put in water baths where they're struggling and they're constrained and stuff are hit on their head and whatever. She's studying their resilience. But what she said, what is always so amazing is how big the variance is. Like how for some people, that's really bad thing. I mean, some rats in this case, there's a really bad thing happening to them. For others, kind of shake it off. And we are trying to understand where does that come from? Where does this heterogeneity across people come from, which I'm ignoring in my model. I'm just taking the cohort average, basically, like the generational average. And I think this polarization, ideological views might play a huge role, and I really hope people will be studying it.
Ulrike, we have a question from the Zoom audience. How correlated is inflation? Has it been across countries? And does it matter for the experience effects you're talking about, whether it's just happening in my country and not others, or if it's a worldwide phenomenon?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So, you know, you might guess already by what I've been telling you, like kind of the world around you has this huge effect on you. Like even the grocery store you go to, the grocery prices you see, you might infer already it's probably pretty localized is the answer. And in fact, with another PhD student, Alex Staniwelcio, which I mentioned, who's now faculty at UC San Diego, I've been studying that within Europe. So, you know, monetary policy is pretty coordinated these days, but still there are cross-country differences in inflation. And of course, in the past, there have been differences in inflation. And we've basically been asking the question, could that help us understand why there are such huge differences in people trying to put their money not in bank accounts, but in some kind of asset such as real estate, right? So like you take, you know, Spain and neighboring France. And in Spain, you have a home ownership rate. So the percentage of population who lives in the home they own themselves, like 90%. In France, significantly lower. How come? I mean, of course, there are many regulatory, you know, subsidies for mortgages reasons, and we know those and we can control for those. But then we did a simple exercise. We said, well, let's just take the, you know, there's an ECB survey on households and people say whether they own a home or not, and they give me the birth year. So let me just get the inflation time series for the country they lived in. And then let's group the countries into those which had really high inflation experiences, where the past, say, 40 years for a homeowner who's 40 now, inflation was in the upper quartile of bad inflation experiences. And let's take the other end of the spectrum, the lower quartile. Lo and behold, the high inflation experience people, they really don't like putting their money in their savings account. They have very high home ownership rate after controlling for these other measures, and vice versa on the low end. So we do think that these more local experiences, these differences in inflation, have a big impact on some of the most important financial decisions you do in your life, like buying a home. For many people, that's the biggest financial transaction they do. That's what we find.
I'm wondering, how much does this rewiring, this plasticity, vary with biological age? Let's say let's say you took a 20-year-old and a 70-year-old and you were able to erase their previous experience, just starting from the same point of view, and that you put them through an inflation experience. My guess is the older person would be less affected than the 20-year-old. And I wonder to what degree does that happen?
Yeah. So yeah. Oh, okay. So the question was to what extent there's a dependence on how old you are in terms of how strong the experience effects are, right? In fact, if you read in the neuroscience books about how much your brain gets wired by these experiences, there's a lot of talk about these impressionable childhood years when plasticity is particularly high. There are often beautiful curves on like when you adjust the most to which type of learning. Typically, there's not an age below, so like it's really hard to pinpoint what the cutoff point is. We had another expert from neuroscience in our study group recently. He said it's 6. It's before 6 or after 6. But then there are others like who are, you know, have different views. I have been trying to see whether I can tease it out in the data, and like backwards, I haven't been able to do it. And my problem has been that, first of all, I can't do this nice experiment I would love to do, like erase, you know, your previous experience and see what happens if we start from fresh. It's not so beautiful, but it would be good to study. And then the issue is that older people are not only maybe having lower neuroplasticity, but they have also a longer lifetime experience. So if I've accumulated 60, 70 years of inflation experience, and then, you know, 2021, 2022 comes and whoa, prices go up, I'm not liking it, but you know, I've seen the 70s, the 80s, I've seen it come down. Like this additional piece of data doesn't change my lifetime average a lot. I'm wiser and not overreacting. While the young folks, I don't know, the 33-year-old or even the 23-year-olds even more, there's like, what? So far, inflation only existed in textbooks. Everything was very stable. And now that, like their whole world is turned upside down. So it's not surprising that I've been finding these effects being much stronger in younger people than older people, simply for the reason that they have had a shorter life, a shorter history. But I do think, based on the science literature I've seen, that you're right, that there's also a less strong rewiring happening. And I would love for that to be studied as well, because I think as economists, we should put more effort into understanding financial decision-making over the life cycle, job decision-making, et cetera. And that I think is an important component. I'm sorry, I don't have evidence yet.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ulrike. Tara, could you help us adjourn after this very lively question and answer?
Thank you, Professor Yagan. My name is Tara Horton. I'm an Associate Director of Development for the Social Sciences, and I just would like to offer a few thank yous before we go to the reception. I lead our Charter Hill Society for Economics and the Social Sciences, the efforts to build support for the departments. I'm also involved in the Women in Leadership Circle for the North Bay. Thank you to our faculty partners, Professor Malmendier for your wonderful talk, for Professor Yagan for your work as development chair and for having a role in putting on this program. Thank you to Britt Celine for your words today and for your volunteering on the Women in Leadership Circle. Last, I just want to thank our Charter Hill Society members, whose leadership level support of our economics annual fund and our other social sciences annual funds provides support for the kind of research that you saw presented here today, and also provides student support. Thank you to our members, and you will be receiving some information in the next few days about how you can join. Thanks again for coming, and enjoy the reception.